going to start in numerical order today. Before we take up bills, I want to make some subcommittee assignments. I am assigning House Bill 75 to Subcommittee 1. That's Chairman Knox's subcommittee. And House Bill 145 to Subcommittee 1. I'm assigning House Bill 167 and 168 to Subcommittee 2, chaired by Vice Chairman Mumford. And hopefully they'll have reports for us soon. I'm going to recognize first today Chairman Franklin on House Bill 6. Let me make a preliminary comment about procedure, if I could. Both of these bills, as every bill that we take up in this committee, go through the subcommittee process. I am going to be a little different this year. We're not going to have repetitive testimony. I don't mind having a summary of that testimony that was presented to the subcommittee or new testimony, but we're going to be I don't think that it's appropriate to take up and have just the same thing rehashed. If someone disagrees with that, I'll be happy to talk to them prior to the next meeting, committee members, that is, prior to the next meeting. Chairman Franklin, House Bill 6.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. House Bill 6 would stop emergency gun confiscation in Georgia, like what happened that we sadly witnessed during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, where instead of fighting crime, we saw law enforcement going door to door confiscating guns from law-abiding gun owners, and where we also saw them confiscating guns from those who were trying to flee the hurricane with their guns with them to keep them from being looted. Last fall, President Bush signed the federal ban on emergency gun confiscation back on October 4th of last year, which effectively bars federal officers from confiscating people's guns during a major disaster or emergency. The main problem with that is that it only applies to federal officers. So what House Bill 6 does is virtually identical to the federal law that was enacted in October of last year, but applies it to state and local officials. And that's basically what it does. The second section, to be consistent, repeals the governor's ability to bar the possession and transportation of firearms, to enable people to carry their firearms with them when they flee their homes, to keep them from being stolen by the looters.
Let me ask the first question, Chairman Franklin. My recollection is the federal legislation was actually sponsored by 2 members of Congress from the state of Louisiana.
That is my understanding as well.
Questions from the committee? Questions of Chairman? Yes, Representative Benfield.
I'm just trying to read is emergency defined somewhere in the code? What constitutes a disaster and emergency?
It's the thing that the governor declares when there's a certain thing, and I would imagine Legislative Council could look up the exact definition, but it would be when the governor declares the state of emergency.
And I have a follow-up. It would be helpful for me to see the full code section 38-3-51. Can you just explain specifically what you're doing in section 2?
It's removing the firearms provision that the governor is able to suspend the sale. If you notice on page 2, line 19, where that is, the governor has the authority to suspend or limit the sale, dispensing, or transportation of alcoholic beverages, or just explosives and combustibles. We're removing the words firearms so that a law-abiding citizen would be able to transport their firearm out of a declared disaster area rather than leave them behind in their home to be looted.
Yes, follow up.
I'm not sure if anyone at the governor's office is here who might be better able to answer this. I remember I think I was around when this bill first went through, and the governor wasn't the current governor, but the governor at the time specifically asked for this provision. Does Governor Perdue have a position on this provision, because it's taking some of his power away?
I have not heard to the contrary.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
Have you asked the governor's office his position on this issue?
You know, the bill was pre-filed, and no one from the governor's office has come to me expressing opposition.
And I'm not taking a position on that issue, but the bill was here last year also.
I just don't remember.
It was in this committee.
But I don't remember the governor's office
Yep.
had a position.
And I don't. Chairman Cooper.
Cindy Franklin, in the same section, I mean, I can understand not confiscating or limiting firearms that individuals own, but the way it's written, it seems like that you are saying it's okay to, I mean, you take away the governor's ability to stop the sale of firearms to people who don't already have them.
If you look at line 22 of the stricken language, which says which was legal and owned by that citizen prior to the declaration.
Right.
I don't know about you, but I don't know too many people who keep every single receipt that they have. So if you're fleeing a disaster area, the only way you would have to prove that you own that firearm prior to the declaration of the state of emergency would be to have the receipt from 10 years prior when you purchased your firearm, and that's just not reasonable.
I mean, I think that's probably taking it to the extreme, because I think that here again, that's for individuals, but I think the upper part on line 20 would mean that the governor would just be able to close any firearm shops or that might be usually sell firearms, and maybe that should be left in there on line 20, but strike the rest of it for individuals.
Well, the remainder was put there to try to make it where the individual would be covered. But the problem is there's no really reasonable way to be able to prove that you are in lawful possession and that you own a firearm prior to the declared state of emergency. Because no one keeps receipts.
Representative Mangum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Franklin, I too, I guess, will really need, and I thought I had it here, but I do not, have the code section 38351, because as I read this, you are striking a provision that makes it clear that if I owned firearms prior to the declaration of the state of emergency, I may keep my firearm. Is that correct? Is that what I think your intent is, you're leaving the language, thank you, sir. You're leaving the language that actually says that the governor may suspend or limit the sale, dispensing, or transportation of alcoholic beverages. You simply do not want the governor to suspend the sale of firearms? Is that your point? Is that your intent? Because you are striking the provision that does do, as a libertarian, that some of your prior views have seemed to lean toward, and that is to allow the liberty of holding a gun. And you mean to strike the individual liberty of having a gun that you previously owned? Is that part of what you're trying to do?
Now, if you look at Section 2, the only thing it's striking is the governor's ability to limit the sale, dispensing, or transportation of firearms. So you would not be someone who is able, this actually would enable someone, if you're in a state of emergency, there's a riot taking place and it's coming close to your house, you might want to go to that neighborhood gun store and buy a firearm to protect your home because of the mob that's headed your way. You might want to encourage them to go to some other neighborhood. It also this would enable you to take your firearm as you flee your home. because of a hurricane or a tornado, any type of natural disaster that the governor has declared a state of emergency over. It would enable you to transport that firearm with you, whereas the current law, the governor can prohibit you from taking your firearm with you, leaving it prey to being looted and stolen and falling into the wrong hands, into the hands of a criminal element.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I want to just read the law because he's doing a negative. You're taking something out of the law. You're not giving a right. You're taking a right away, as I read it. Unless, is there another provision that actually says that a person may hold a firearm and leave with that firearm other than in this provision?
Now, this provision deals with the governor's emergency powers during a declared state of emergency. And the right that's taken away is taken away from the governor during a declared state of emergency to keep you from being able to purchase a firearm for your own protection as a law-abiding citizen, or from being able to transport your firearm with you as you flee a natural disaster area.
Thank you. I'll read the law. Thank you.
Along with his able assistant.
We had to look in the pocket part.
And I will let y'all read a moment and recognize Chairman Knox.
Representative Franklin, this bill only applies to that particular code section that we passed a couple of years ago, which was basically our version of the Homeland Security Act. Is that right?
That's correct.
And so, in that context, nothing in here bestows any new rights on a person who owns a weapon, whether it's a gun or whatever else it is. Correct?
That is correct.
All right. And since we also passed, I believe it was last year, the castle provision, which allows a person to defend their own home using what force is necessary, then that would permit a homeowner to use a weapon if somebody's trying to come into their home, regardless of the circumstances, if they're coming in to do harm to the homeowner. Correct?
That's correct.
That being the case, then why would I not want someone to have a weapon to defend themselves when they're in maximum danger, as we saw in a situation like we saw in New Orleans, where the only people who were committing offenses were the thugs that had guns, as far as I can tell?
That's correct. I don't believe anyone committing an offense was a law-abiding citizen. They were all criminals and thugs. They were not licensed gun owners. They weren't. You're absolutely right. Thank you. And one other thing that I would like to point out is, let's say that you needed a little bit extra cash and you went down and pawned your gun at the neighborhood pawn shop. And all of a sudden now here's the tornado, here's the hurricane, whatever, you've got this natural disaster, you'd like to go get your gun back. And the way the law is currently written, if the governor declared a state of emergency, you would not be able to get it back to protect yourself or your family. So this would correct that, to enable a person to protect themselves.
Follow up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One other question with regard to the issue of whether or not you can buy a weapon after the disaster begins. We don't have any prohibitions on somebody buying new locks for their doors when something like this takes place, do we?
No, we don't.
Thank you.
Representative Abdul Salam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question would be the same question I think I asked last year with the similar provision, if not the same one. How can you look at somebody and tell whether they're law-abiding citizens or not?
Well, what you can do is look at them and tell whether are they breaking into a home, are they throwing a brick through a store window. You can tell, are they committing a criminal act. Now, thankfully in this country we are not at the point where we have thought police, and I hope we never get to that point, Mr. Chairman, where we have thought police in this country. What the state of Georgia punishes are criminal acts, and you're deemed to be law-abiding unless you have committed a criminal act. And someone robbing, someone looting, those criminal acts are very easy to identify.
But if during the state of emergency and somebody that's never broken the law in their life is out in the street even to protect themselves, but they don't look like they're a law-abiding citizen, would their gun be taken? I mean, that's just what you saw in Hurricane Katrina, and maybe we looked at different footage, but what you saw in Hurricane Katrina was both the thugs and the law-abiding people trying to protect themselves and trying to get ahead and trying to get out. And I'm just concerned that there is no way that law enforcement can look at a mob and point out that was law-abiding, that was law-abiding, that was a thug. I'm just concerned that opens up too much. And the other question is, if there's a state of emergency declared and you go to the local store to purchase a gun, how do you then register the gun, which is required in this provision? How would the registration process be carried out?
Right now, I don't believe Georgia registers the gun. There is a procedure for you fill out the forms with the Brady check that you identify yourself, and they do their what they call the instant check, and unless you've already demonstrated yourself to be law-abiding with your carry permit, that pretty much demonstrates that you're law-abiding. That hasn't been revoked. You fill out your paperwork, and away you go. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I'm speaking specifically to Section 1, line 22.
That is something that cannot happen.
Okay.
That where an agent cannot require you to register your firearm. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting me clarify that.
Further questions from the committee? Representative Benfield.
Thank you. Representative Franklin, is this language taken from federal law, the Vitter Amendment that passed this past summer?
This is virtually identical to Public Law 109-295, which was enacted on October 4th of last year. Yes, ma'am.
So if it's existing federal law, which trumps state law, why do we need this at the state level?
Well, I appreciate that question because that federal law specifically references federal officers, not state or local officers. So a federal officer would not be able to come into Georgia during a declared state of emergency and confiscate your firearm, but a state or local officer still could. So while this bill, House Bill 6, tracks that federal language, but it applies that same language virtually to a state or local official. Thank you.
Brother, we have one person that's signed up. Any further questions from members of the committee? If not, Ms. Johnson, did you testify before the subcommittee? Okay, can you share with us a very brief version of your...
I have some additional information that I didn't see.
Okay, why don't you deal with that then?
Okay, I'd be glad to. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Alice Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of Georgians for Gun Safety, an organization that has been in existence since 1993. Our goal is to reduce injuries and deaths from firearms, and we are supportive of responsible gun ownership and always have been. We are opposed to House Bill 6. I reiterated those reasons earlier in a subcommittee. We're concerned about the governor's emergency powers being restricted. I would comment that it's my recollection that the declaration of a state of emergency in the code section has some legislative oversight attached to it, number one. And number two, the state of emergency, the declaration of a state of emergency, if, for instance, it was Governor Perdue was called upon to make that statement, would be in conjunction with and consultation with all of the state agencies that would be involved, whether we're talking about GEMA, whether we're talking about the State Patrol, whether we're talking about the GBI, that all of those state agencies and their leadership are consulted in the process of declaring a state of emergency. And I think it's important to say that while the final decision rests with the governor, there are many different agencies within state that we rely upon on a regular basis who would help make that decision. I did want to just say that after hearing Mr. Franklin's testimony and the discussion in the subcommittee meeting on Thursday, I went back and researched the law that he refers to, the federal law that he refers to. And in fact, that law is part of House Resolution 5441, which is the continuing resolution for appropriations for the Homeland Security Department at the federal government. The amendment to that appropriations bill, which includes the language, part of which is represented in House Bill 6, also includes a limitation on that language. And that limitation reads, "Nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit any person in subsection A from requiring the temporary surrender of a firearm as a condition for entry into any mode of transportation used for rescue or evacuation during a major disaster or emergency, provided that such temporarily surrendered firearm is returned at the completion of such rescue or evacuation." And I have made copies of this. That limitation is not included in House Bill 6, and so the language differs somewhat from federal law. The other thing is that House Resolution 5441 was a continuing appropriations reauthorization, which means that any amendment or any language attached to it is only good for the year that the authorization takes place. And so this language is not permanent federal law even now. And there is probably some question about whether the 110th Congress would make it permanent law or include it within its reauthorization of the Homeland Security Act. And I have a copy of that.
Did you bring one for all the members?
I have distributed a few. I have 4 copies here. We did that research after the subcommittee meeting to check.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Questions from the committee of Ms. Johnson? Yes. Yes, Representative Levitas.
You referenced the provision that had to do with being able to temporarily ask somebody to give up their firearm in exchange for transportation or a civil emergency. How does that? What is your point in bringing that up in relationship to this bill?
Well, my point is that even at the federal level, and using the reference that's been made to the state language, there were limitations on it at the federal level that were not included in the state in House Bill 6.
But if we were to include that provision, that wouldn't change your opposition to the bill at large, would it?
We would still have problems with the emergency powers section.
Okay.
Absolutely. We have always been opposed to the governor's emergency powers over firearms being removed. And I would only add to that in 2002, the language which is now being struck from the bill is the language that was put into the bill in an attempt to protect the individual rights of legal firearms owners. And the history of the bill is such that it was introduced in '68. Emergency powers for governors are across the states. That's a standard piece of state law for most states. And in 2002, the rights of gun owners were further protected. I want all of us just to be very clear about we're not interested in using rhetoric or anything else to talk about this, but we are very interested in the committee being as aware as possible of what the decisions are they're making.
If I may, one more. And you also referenced the fact that this was part of a continuing resolution at the federal level, and that by its nature it has an expiration date.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Again, what I'm trying to find out is what relevance that has for the substantive merit of the bill. The fact that procedurally it was attached to an expiring resolution.
Well, I say that because I wanted it to be very clear that this language is not simply a case of referencing federal law that already exists. I mean, that's not a totally accurate description of that language in House Bill 6.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, if I may, just one more follow-up. As I understand it, it is an accurate reference. The only thing that it doesn't have is it doesn't have an expiring provision after a year that a continuing resolution might, right? Other than that, it accurately tracks the legislation, doesn't it?
Well, but it's missing a limitation.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Representative Levitas. Representative Bearden.
Questions, Representative Franklin. Representative Franklin.
May I cut you off?
Sure.
Were there any further questions for Ms. Johnson? Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Franklin, from talking to you personally, I think you have a pretty good understanding of the Second Amendment of the Constitution, correct?
I sure hope so. I've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution of both the U.S. government and the state.
I'm looking at it right now, and at the end of it states, under the Second Amendment, shall not be infringed, just the last couple words in there. I do not see an asterisk in there stating that in the set of state of emergencies, a governor or anyone else has the authority to unlawfully take a law-abiding citizen's firearm. Am I missing that somewhere in the Constitution? Because I haven't read it.
I haven't found it anywhere, and I do take my oath of office seriously, and that's why I brought this legislation forward. Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification.
Mr. Davis, you didn't sign up, but I'm going to recognize you briefly, just so that we're clear from now on. If you wish to speak, I need for you to sign up in advance, okay? You're recognized very briefly.
I just wanted to address the point raised by Representative Cooper about striking the power to limit sales. This is state law. It doesn't affect at all federal law, which controls firearm sale. In other words, if you're concerned that this law would allow people to buy guns freely, that's not going to be the case, because there's federal law now, and this does not repeal any federal law. It requires anybody purchasing a firearm to go through the National Criminal Background Check.
Okay. Thank you. Further questions by members of the committee? Representative Benfield.
I guess this question is for Representative Franklin. I'm always concerned about who's not at the table, which is why I asked where the governor is on this bill, because he certainly is affected, or his powers are affected. And I was hoping to hear from perhaps the National Guard or the police or the Sheriff's Association, since this does affect law enforcement powers, and they haven't spoken on this bill. So I guess I'll have to ask the author, do you know if the chiefs of police or the Sheriff's Association have a position on this bill? And if so, what is it?
Like I said, back in the first week of pre-filing was when this bill was pre-filed, and I have heard of no one in opposition other than the woman who spoke in opposition just a few minutes ago. No one has come to me to tell me that they or their group is opposed.
Do you have a question?
We seem to have...
Do you have a question? Okay, I mean, if you do, I'll recognize you.
Yes, please.
Chairman Cooper.
We seem to have a person in the audience who seems to have some disagreement with maybe that he did voice opposition, and I'm wondering, Mr. Chairman, if he might be allowed to speak. It's the gentleman in the...
Tom Bank, Virginia. I did talk, excuse me, with Representative Franklin about our concerns, particularly about the civil penalties in there that will punish law enforcement, that in a situation, as one representative described, might be confusing, and it opens up a can of worms from our standpoint that we're opposed to with respect to putting law enforcement in this type of predicament. We're particularly opposed to that particular section of this bill.
Okay. Further questions to the committee?
Sure, one clarification.
Representative Setzler and then Representative Benfield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To the author, Chairman Franklin, out of abundance of caution, I looked on Section 2, page 2 of the bill, line 20, where it refers to explosives and combustibles. I know we had a healthy discussion last year when this came before committee. I just, out of abundance of caution, wanted to make sure that this doesn't allow law enforcement, or rather the governor, to suspend the sale or possession of ammunition, which would be subject to from a definition standpoint. Is ammunition considered a firearm for purposes of this bill?
I don't believe that ammunition would be left as I would have had that same concern, and I do thank you for the question. But an explosive or combustible would not include ammunition.
Representative Benfield.
May I ask ask a question of Mr. Bankhead with the GBI?
Sure.
Now,
I can't make him answer it, though.
Okay. Are you referring to subsections B and C on the top of page 2 that you have concerns with? Thank you.
Representative Mangum.
Chairman Franklin, is it your position with respect to H.R. 5441 that was provided by a distinguished witness who has opposition to your bill, is there the limitation of a person temporarily boarding a mode of transportation? Are you opposed adamantly to the provision that would indicate that if I came to rescue you, that you could not temporarily place it in some type of lockup? For example, when I go into the courthouse, if I have a gun legally, I have to put it in a locker or something. Or if I go on an airplane, if I ride an airplane, are you saying that I would still have the right to carry a gun on the airplane?
No, that does not apply here, because that law is already in place. This is only dealing with...
Is that a federal law or is it a state law?
Right on an airplane, I believe. In addition, you do have a state law. This does not override that state law. This is only dealing with the governor's emergency powers. It does not deal with our law that you can't carry on mass transit. It doesn't deal with being able to go into an airport. This bill does not deal with that. This bill only deals with your emergency power.
Well, is it not correct, sir, that the state of emergency does in fact override existing laws? Isn't that the purpose for declaring a state of emergency?
But what this bill does, it allows a law-abiding citizen to be able to possess and transport their own firearm. And that's pure and simple. That's what it does.
Okay. It's my understanding you've taken this law from the federal law, H.R. 5441. And that law does have a provision that says that nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit any person in subsection A from requiring the temporary surrender of a firearm as a condition for entry into any mode of transportation used for rescue or evacuation during a major disaster emergency, provided that such temporary surrender firearm is returned at the completion of such rescue or evacuation. Are you opposed to having such a provision in your proposed legislation?
I don't see a need for it, because you've got it in the federal provision. And any type of where a federal officer, if you go to the airport during a state of emergency, if you can get a flight out, you already have the federal officers working for the TSA dealing with an issue such as that. So you would not have a state officer at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. You'd only be having federal officers there anyway. I believe that would be confusing to the legislation and would actually harm the bill.
If I may further, and I don't want to belabor this, Mr. Chairman, but I thought the reason you were bringing this is for the specific instance where the federal law does not cover state officials. In fact, I am a little concerned, I didn't raise it earlier, but in the case of a National Guard in the state of emergency, for example, right now, we have National Guard in Iraq. Is a National Guard person in Iraq now considered a federal officer or a state officer?
I'm not an expert on the military. I couldn't answer that question.
Well, and that's why I'm bringing this to bear, because if I come to rescue you, and you have...
And I would really appreciate it.
And I would do it. I would do it.
I know you would.
And if I said, sir, as a requirement of getting on this rescue vehicle, whether it's a boat or a bus, I have this locker here. If you would temporarily place it in the locker, and here's a key for it, even a key if I can have separate compartments or one compartment. And at the end of this trip, I'll give you your gun back or your firearm back. Are you opposed to that type of precaution?
I don't see a need to have that in state law. it gets back to what Representative Bearden asked, and it boils down to the Constitution. A declared state of emergency does not suspend the Constitution. The Constitution is the Constitution.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the length that you've allowed.
Always enjoy
this last.
Enjoy your probing questions, Rick.
My last quote.
Always.
I'm trying to do it in a succinct fashion. In the situation where I have intra-transportation, where the federal government is not implicated, because I'm not going across the state line, because I can have a private plane, or I don't know whether Charlie Brown applies or not. But if I have a plane at Charlie Brown Airport and I want to fly from Charlie Brown to Savannah, I stay in Georgia. I don't implicate the federal government, and I may be mistaken as to what laws are implicated by simply going up in the air. But I'm trying to give you an example that there are situations where we can be, as a state, not implicating multi-jurisdictions to implicate federal jurisdiction. And I'm asking you, for those limited circumstances, are you saying you do not want any restrictions even in those instances?
That is correct.
So if I have a plane that's at a private airstrip, I own a plane, thank God when I get my G4, my G7, if I come and rescue you, I say, well, I want to rescue you.
Rescue.
If I want to rescue you and you have your guns out, and I say, well, if I let everybody on with guns, you got to lock them up over in this one location. When you get off, you can get back on. Are you telling me you will have a right? Well, I will have to have a fight with you whether to rescue you then in that situation because you will have a right to board my plane. In fact, you may even hold me at gunpoint.
Well, that would be a criminal act, and this bill would totally not apply.
Okay. Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman Knox,
Mr. Chairman, at appropriate time, I have a motion.
you're recognized.
I move we do pass House Bill 6.
We have a motion that House Bill 6 be given a do pass recommendation. Is there discussion on the motion?
At the appropriate time, I have an amendment, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. You're recognized.
I propose an amendment that we add the language of subchapter B, and I have to ask Legislative Council for the appropriate location, but that the language that says in the handout that we were given, the H.R. 5441, it says, nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit any person in subsection A, and it may change according to subsection may be different according to Legislative Council, from requiring the temporary surrender of a firearm as a condition for entry into any mode of transportation used for rescue or evacuation during a major disaster or emergency, provided that such temporarily surrendered firearm is returned at the completion of such rescue or evacuation, period.
You are offering that in lieu of or in addition to?
In addition to the language provided herein.
And where are you offering that?
I am offering that language with the council and advice of Legislative Council to have maybe a subsection 8, because I am not sure whether or not there is a subsection 9, 8.1 or 9 under 38351. Subsection B of A, paragraph 8, I guess. Right now we have a subsection 8. Maybe it'll be 8A and 8B. This will be a new. No.
Subsection D.
Probably on page 2 you would designate current subsection D as C and C as D and put it in as a new D.
A new D. A new B as in boy.
So that would be lines 4 and 5 of page 2.
So the amendment changes line 5 where it says B, that will be a C, and line 10 where there is currently a C, that will change to D, and we will insert a new B that will have this as a limitation. And so the subsection A language would remain the same?
Is that, as we're writing amendments here in committee, so help us out.
We don't have to put the word limitation in, do we, Council? We were not, I didn't read limitation. I didn't read that word.
Instead, there's a language in the Federal Act that during a major disaster or emergency, and the language in House Bill 6 is declared official state of emergency. So it's already did limit that language. And also in the federal wording, there's nothing in this section, and it's the code section.
Thank you, Jill.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, we have an amendment now that's been moved. First of all, does everyone understand what I'm going to refer to as the temporary surrender amendment? Is that a fair description, Representative Mangum?
Temporary surrender, we can say that.
Okay.
For transportation purposes.
Okay. Representative Benfield.
I'd just like to speak briefly in favor of the amendment. The way I read this is it would allow, say, the National Guard, if they had a bus that was an emergency vehicle to help transport citizens out of a disaster zone, that this would give our National Guard or our sheriffs or our police the authority to temporarily take guns away from people boarding these emergency vehicles during the time that they're being transported out of harm's way. I think this is a very reasonable amendment and in the interest of protecting our law enforcement during an emergency or a disaster. So I support this amendment.
Any further discussion on the Mangum amendment?
Mr. Chairman?
Representative Sessom.
I'm concerned by the amendment. And again, to put to Representative Benefield's point, it's my understanding that the expectation of law enforcement officers in Hurricane Katrina was that the weapons would be handed over not permanently, they were being permanently confiscated by the government, but at some point there was an expectation they'd be turned back over. I think that misses the point of allowing citizens access to their firearms as is protected by the Constitution, and I would urge members of the committee to view this as an unnecessary infringement to Representative to our committee secretary's point.
But we're on the amendment now. Yes, Representative Abrams.
I would like to speak in support of the amendment. The Constitution does permit the application of regulation when the infringement is not one that fetters the ability to exercise due process of law. To that extent, when law enforcement has to transport someone because there's an emergency situation, it would seem to me that a temporary surrender does not infringe unduly upon the person's ability to retrieve their weapon at the time they're then let off of the bus or the boat. Coming from the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, where my family lives, my family was involved in the transportation of persons who were impacted by Hurricane Katrina, and there is not time to vet whether a person lawfully owns a firearm or does not. And to put National Guardsmen or those who are conscripted into service at the time in a position of having to determine whether or not a person lawfully owns a permit, I think puts an undue burden on law enforcement. Moreover, the Constitution does not prohibit infringement exclusively. If that were true, then you would not allow felons to own firearms. The Constitution says you shall not infringe, but we have read historically into the infringement clause the ability to put regulation that is reasonable and that does not unduly harm the ability to exercise your rights under the law. So I would support support the amendment.
Further discussion by members of the committee on the amendment. Further discussion. Hearing none, Chair will call the question. Here where we are, we have a motion by Chairman Knox, seconded I think by Representative Setzler, to give a due pass to House Bill 6 as it came to us from the author. We now have the amendment by Representative Mangum, seconded by Representative Benfield, I believe. So we're going to vote on the amendment first. Any questions? All in favor of adopting the Mangum Amendment to House Bill 6, please indicate by raising your right hand. All opposed? What was the vote? The motion to adopt the Mangum Amendment fails by a vote of 8 to 9. Any further? Chairman Cooper. Okay. Recognize Chairman Cooper.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I would like for us to look on page 2, line 20. I certainly have no problem with private citizens having firearms, but I have trouble with the sale of firearms in emergency situations when people might have knee-jerk reactions to run out and buy arms if they can get a hold of them. And I would like for us not to strike firearms from the governor's powers.
Okay. Point of clarification, and be sure I understand your amendment, would be to take out everything that the House Bill 6 would strike in subsection 8, which is section 2 of the bill.
No, sir, just the word.
Just the word firearms. Okay.
The sale of Midland.
Okay. We have a motion that we amend House Bill 6 by simply not deleting the word firearms at the beginning of line 20 on page 2. First of all, are there questions about, just a moment, questions about what the amendment does?
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Levitas.
I do have a question.
Okay.
I read what the motion, the amendment would be, is it would remove the word firearms, but it would leave stricken everything from provided through the United States.
That's my understanding.
In which case it would change what's in existence now, making it so that there are no protections, as I understand it, for individual firearm owners under the proposed amendment. Is that correct, Mr. Chairman?
I'm not going to interpret the amendment, but I do understand the amendment the way you understand it to be, which is that everything after the semicolon after combustibles would still be stricken. Is that correct, Chairman Cooper?
I'm not legal counsel. I do want people to still be able to have their firearms, so I would ask legal counsel to help me out if we need to leave that in, if putting firearms back to the governor's discretion and we need to leave in that last part, then that's what I'd like the amendment to cover.
Sheriff's not going to entertain anything that deals with the alcoholic beverages part of that and whether it applies on Sunday or not. So, just so we're clear, okay? Jill, can you help us again?
I think that if you restored the word firearms to line 20, you're basically undoing what's done in section 1 of the bill. You would be creating a conflict because section 1 of the bill says that you can't stop or people can carry their weapons. And then section 2 of the bill would be the governor's power. So I'm not quite sure what you're trying to do, but if you're just restoring the word firearm.
I'll withdraw the amendment and I just don't think we should limit the governor's emergency powers.
Any objection to the withdrawal of the amendment? Hearing none. Amendment withdrawn. Representative Randall.
I was trying to get a point of clarification. I think you were trying to address the purchase, new purchases of firearms. That's what she was trying to address.
All right. Is there
a way that she...
Chairman Cooper wants to do an amendment that would deal with the issue of the purchase of firearms during declared states of emergency. Is that...
Yes, sir. Not anything to do with the individual's right to carry guns they already own.
Okay. Well, if we did that, we could say, I was reading on line 19, suspend or limit the sale, dispensing, or transportation of alcoholic beverages, explosives, and combustibles, or suspend or limit the sale of
suspend the sale of firearms. I don't know. I think the conflict still exists.
Would the better approach be just to vote against the bill?
Yes, I think so.
No, and I'm not, I'm being a little facetious.
No, that's all right.
I want to help.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Bob Bill Salon.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That goes back to a question I asked earlier in terms of the registration. So basically what the bill is saying is that if there's a declared state of emergency and people just want to buy guns at that time, they don't have to meet the registration requirements. How would we then go back retroactively and do that? There's no registration requirement during the state of emergency. Does that mean that they'll have unregistered weapons?
Chairman Franklin, you wish to respond to that question?
This does not nullify any federal law at all. You still have to go through a licensed federal firearms dealer to buy a firearm. This does not negate that whatsoever. You still have to obey all federal firearms laws.
But it still says on Section 1, Line 22 that it cannot require registration of any firearm for which registration is not required.
Because currently there is no requirement to register your gun. During a declared state of emergency, what the bill says is no one can require the registration at that point, since there is no registration currently.
Well, when would you register it?
You don't register anything, that's all.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Joe, you're still thinking? If you are, I've got a couple of hands up.
Well, there's one thing, can I bounce back to Chairman Franklin? I don't think that his section 16-11-1 actually deals with the issue of sale. And so, therefore, maybe it would work.
Okay. Do you understand what it is that Chairman Cooper intends to do by an amendment? I mean, I want her to have a fair opportunity to...
She wants the governor to be able to still have the power to suspend or limit firearm sales.
Okay, while you're continuing to think, let me recognize Representative Levitas.
Really just a question and maybe a more comment to legal counsel. I agree with you. It seems to me that if what you're trying to do is prevent the sale, unless you're going to say that somehow preventing the sale constitutes a seizure for the purposes of Section 1, which I think that'd be a pretty big stretch to do, you can make a further exception there and say that, sales of firearms can be, if that's the intent of the amendment, that firearms could be accepted from the general prohibition, because all this does is say where it's not otherwise limited by this article, and that would just be a limit that the amendment would place by that article. So why couldn't you just separate that out if in fact that's the intention, is to make an exception just for the sale or prohibition?
I agree. I think that the issue, I'm not quite sure on line 19 what the word dispensing means, as it has to do with firearms, but certainly Section 1 of the bill deals with transportation of firearms. So you would have to have a new clause. You couldn't just restore the word firearms.
Okay. Let's see another hand. Apparently did not. Chairman Cooper, what's your pleasure?
It's complicated. I'll just vote against the bill because of this.
You have that right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Chairman Knox. I'm not going to recognize you right this moment, but the moment is drawing nigh. Representative Benfield. Okay.
I move that on page 2 we strike lines 5 and 16, which is removing subsection D and C.
My concern with these two subsections were the concerns raised by the GBI that in cases of an emergency where law enforcement has, with every good intention and trying to enforce some type of order, seizes a gun or firearm, these provisions allow law enforcement to be sued in the courts and for as sanctions and costs to be assessed against them. And I think that's a very chilling effect on our law enforcement in the time of an emergency. So I would move to strike those two subsections.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, we have a motion to amend House Bill 6 proposed by Representative Benfield, and I think everyone should understand that rather easily. That would delete subsections B and C on page 2, lines 5 through 15. Chairman Franklin.
Mr. Chairman, isn't it true that on the little piece of paper that the woman opposed to private firearms ownership handed out, that the federal law, that Section C of that Section 706 has this private right of action in it, and we're virtually tracking that federal language with this private right of action?
I think the members of this committee have that in their folder and certainly can determine that for themselves. Any further discussion on the Benfield amendment? Representative Bearden.
I'll make a quick, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
As of right now, if a law enforcement officer violates someone's constitutional rights, they can be arrested, jailed, and fined. Is that correct? But right now, if they violate this constitutional right, we're giving them the okay to do that? Exactly.
Then why do you need a special provision?
That's one thing I want to clarify.
Did you get your question answered?
I think we did.
Okay. All right. Chairman Cooper.
What was the answer?
I don't know. They were whispering amongst themselves. Apparently, it wasn't important enough to share with the rest of us. Chairman Cooper.
I mean, I think there is a difference I would like to point out, and they're saying that they can be assessed attorney fees because of number B, the limitation that especially in transporting people, that we have the law enforcement would have the ability to ask for a temporary surrender as they try to rescue people. So I think that it's not quite the same as just saying it's in the federal law.
Okay. Representative Benfield.
Very brief. I'm not an expert on this area, but I think sovereign immunity would apply for law enforcement seizing firearms, and this is opening a whole can of worms with the civil right of action and allowing the courts to assess sanctions and fines. I just think this is a whole area of the law that I do not feel prepared to venture into. I miss Bordeaux.
Probably having a great day.
Spend time with his kids.
Any further discussion on the Benfield amendment? Any further discussion? If not, all in favor of adopting the Benfield amendment to House Bill 6, please indicate by raising your right hand. All opposed? The Benfield amendment has not been adopted by a vote of 7 to 10. Any further discussion on House Bill 6? Hearing none. The House Bill 6 you have before you without amendment, and the question is now on a do-pass recommendation. All in favor of giving House Bill 6 a do-pass recommendation, please indicate by raising your right hand. All opposed? House Bill 6 has been given a do-pass recommendation by a vote of 10 to 7. Is the next one easier?
Gosh, I hope so. I didn't know we was going to do it.
Just shooting them up early in the session.
We're having gun day today. It may be our only gun day. We still have one more bill on the agenda. Representative Mangum.
Point of clarification. Under what circumstances are we required to announce that we filed a minority report for what is the procedure?
Representative Mangum, I'll be happy to work with you on that. I think you actually have 24 or 48 hours to tell me that, but if you're telling me now, I will so note that and certainly would, we'll not have procedural issues. Okay, that's fine. You have that right. Anyone, we're taking up next House Bill 89. Those of you who were here for 6 and don't wish to be here for 89, I'm going to give you about a few seconds to leave the room so that we will not have a lot of noise. I guess folks still want to be here for 89. You want to come around and Representative Bearden, or you want to do it from there?
Whatever you want me to do, Mr. Chairman.
Wherever you want to be.
Yeah, a ton of people pointing at me saying, so.
I don't think it was any committee members, but that's okay.
It was, but I'll try to be cordial.
And unfortunately, Tom Knotts was not here to see me do that.
Who is he? Yes. A couple of members leave, and I'm going to catch our collective breaths here a moment.
I don't know if that's a good sign or not. If they leave, is that a good sign or not?
Forfeit their right to speak and ask questions and offer amendments. Why don't you go ahead? Chair recognizes Representative Bearden on House Bill 89.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. We went through this on the subcommittee, so I'll try to make this shorter and hopefully shorter than the last bill. House Bill 89 does one thing. This bill makes sure that all law-abiding citizens, while transporting his or her firearm in a private motor vehicle, cannot be arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. Right now, the law states the firearm must be in an open manner and fully exposed to view or in a glove box or console. This bill clarifies that law. Especially, it clarifies it to law enforcement to what's legal or what's not legal. There could be some questions, and I hate to say I'm breaking the law, but as of right now, when I carry my firearm in my vehicle, it's between the console of the seat and my right leg. Some law enforcement officers, I wouldn't when I was law enforcement, would take that as being illegal. But it's the safest place, I think, for that firearm as a law-abiding citizen in my vehicle. What you also may hear is that we're expanding these rights. We're not giving any immunity to felons or anyone that's not eligible to carry a firearm. This goes to law-abiding citizens only. Some folks may say we're endangering law enforcement. I promise you I would never do anything in this world to endanger any of my partners that I had in the past in law enforcement. I think this bill clarifies that law to make sure an undue scuffle does not take place from a law-abiding citizen who believes they have the right to keep that firearm in their vehicle. You also may hear we're trying to expand the gun rights. I don't think that's true. Our Second Amendment right has been so decimated over the last 30 to 40 years by liberal courts that it's just totally dismantled the Second Amendment. And to show you how much the Second Amendment meant to some of our founding fathers, since Chairman Munford brought up some past for us last time, we'll bring up some now from 1787, not to do with Irish, but American history. Under Patrick Henry, who stated, when talking about the Second Amendment, the great objective is to make every man armed. I think we came a long way from what they were originally trying to do under the Second Amendment. If you look at House Bill 89, I'll briefly tell you what we've done to this law, 1611-126, subsection D and now subsection E. When we first discussed this bill last year, D and E was kind of layered on top of each other, and it kind of made it confusing. What we actually did last year was we infringed on people's right to carrying a firearm in public transportation, and that bill did not go forward, thankfully. What we now have is a new subsection E that just states that while a person is transporting a firearm in their vehicle, it can be anywhere in their vehicle, and they're not going to have to worry about being hit for carrying a concealed weapon. I don't believe we should make criminals out of law-abiding citizens. If they are breaking the law with that firearm, then there are charges that can be made on that. If we can do a bill saying that you can't carry a gun to rob a store, then we'll pass it, but it won't work. It just don't happen that way. Criminals are criminals, and this is for law-abiding citizens. At this time, Mr. Chairman, I'll take any questions from the committee or
questions from the committee for the author. Questions from the committee. Representative Mangum.
In the unfortunate instance, we had a situation very recently where a 2-year-old, 4-year-old, in numerous instances where kids get guns. And for the record, I own a firearm. However, I have a 3-year-old who's about to be 4 next month. No, in March, that's not. She is very active. If I got out of my car very quickly and forgot that I put my gun on the side of my seat, I am very concerned that we'll have some kids who are now living who may be injured or injure someone else by playing. I did not understand how yesterday I had a brother who come over to my house to get a Christmas present. I don't know how she got a present from where it was, but she did and opened it and she was playing with a little device, and it was not a danger to her, thank God. But kids can do some of this. They get into things. And in a glove compartment, for example, you have the ability to, if you wish to, lock it or unlock it. And so, in those defined instances where you may have a kid, I am sure that no one in here is perfect. And under the unfortunate circumstances where you maybe forget that you had, I left my gun in there, like you lose the keys. If anybody in here has never lost keys, take my hat off to you. But you may just misplace it for a moment. But those moments are the difference sometimes between life and death in this instance. And I'm all for you to have the gun. I'm all for you to have the firearm. But the major purpose, your major purpose is so that an officer will not lawfully charge someone with concealment of a firearm. Is that your major basis for bringing this legislation, or is your major basis that you're trying to protect the right to actually possess the firearm pursuant to the Second Amendment?
I think I got multiple questions, so let me break them down. The first one is to make sure that a law-abiding citizen is not wrongfully arrested for carrying a firearm in the motor vehicle. To the children, I have children myself. Some parents go out and buy lock boxes for those guns, especially if they got children that can get into things. I have a 7-year-old. On the record, I have firearms. He knows how to operate each and every one of them. That's my way of teaching him gun safety, make sure he understands the dangers of gun laws. I feel that's my responsibility as a parent. And I believe every parent has the right to teach their kid the way they feel is best for their home. My concern is that a law-abiding citizen in transportation of that firearm, as we know how dangerous it can be, especially here in Atlanta, has that right to get to that firearm to protect themselves their family or an innocent third person in case someone tries to harm them. If they want to lock it up in the box, they can, or in the console. They're going to pay a heck of a time trying to get it if they need it locked up, but that's their decision. So I hope I answered your question on that and gave you the remedy to what can be bought to protect those guns from the children at home. If I did, I'm sorry. I don't want to ask for a rephrase, but there were several questions. I hope I addressed them all.
In the instance where a gun is, well, first question, do you have any statistics that show that officers are unlawfully charging people with concealing firearms? Do you have any statistics that support that?
I don't, but in some big cities, say New York, where that mayor definitely don't like firearms whatsoever, they may tell their police officers to enforce it to the most extreme measure possible. But in 15 years of vehicle stops, this bill right here clarifies to make sure we know in the law enforcement community what's legal and not legal. If you're a felon or you're not eligible for that firearm, then you're going to jail for possessing it. If you're a law-abiding citizen, then you're a protector under the state of this. Under the state of this.
In your opinion, is it possible for me to teach my 30-year-old gun safety?
You can never start too early teaching children about gun safety.
Representative Setzler.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple questions for the presenter of the bill. Just clarifying questions. Under current law, just so I understand where we are, if I'm transporting a firearm in a motor vehicle, I can have it clearly exposed to open view or in the glove box. Is that right?
That's correct.
If I were taking, for example, my two boys, I've got a 4-year-old and an 8-year-old, if we were going on a camping trip or a hunting trip, and I were to take the firearm, stuff it down into a pack, or hide it somewhere else in the car so that they couldn't get to it. They're just learning gun safety. They're not there yet. So I try to keep the firearms away from them and show it to them in a very controlled environment. I would currently be violating Georgia law because I'm concealing it somewhere else in the car.
You could be taken to jail, yes, sir.
I think this bill simply seems to address what I see a safety issue whereby firearms
Further questions for the author? We have two people signed up to speak on this. Ms. Johnson, did you speak in subcommittee on this one?
Yes, sir.
Okay, can you give us the brief version?
We are opposed to this legislation from the standpoint of law enforcement. We are concerned about the statistics related to how many people, how many law-abiding citizens are in fact oppressed by this legislation. We haven't heard that. What we're mostly concerned with at this point is the ability of law enforcement to tell the difference between a law-abiding citizen and someone who has either criminal intent or is in fact a criminal who is already breaking the law by possessing that firearm. We believe that the current code section makes that a little easier, and that by removing any restrictions from the location of a firearm in a vehicle, that the personal safety of law enforcement officers is reduced, and the ability to follow up in terms of discovering whether there are drugs in the car, whether there's a fugitive, these folks are fugitives, whether there are any other reasons to believe that a crime has been committed will also be reduced. Our conversations with law enforcement suggest that that in fact is the case, and so that's why we oppose it.
Thank you very much. Questions of Ms. Johnson from the committee? Chairman Franklin.
Just for clarification, as an esteemed attorney, do you know of any criminal that would obey the law? Isn't by definition a criminal someone who does not obey the law?
Since you asked me that as an attorney, I'd have to charge you for my answer. Further questions? Further questions of Ms. Johnson?
Thank you,
Ms.
Mr. Chairman.
Johnson. Ed Stone?
Yes, sir.
And please identify, I'm not familiar with your organization.
Your Honor, my name is Ed Stone. I'm the president of GeorgiaCarry.org. It is an organization that's dedicated to protecting the right of its members to keep and bear arms under the Georgia Constitution, which, unlike the Second Amendment, doesn't mention militia. And I'm here to speak in strong support of House Bill 89. I'm a former law enforcement officer, 12 years of experience, so I'm 3 years shy of the representative's experience, but I'm an attorney now, and my experience has led me to believe that this sort of change in the law will not be a problem. As many of you already know, the law currently allows those who have a firearms license to keep the weapon anywhere in the vehicle. This would change only the law for those eligible for a license but who do not have one. I'd like to give one example, which was my wife, who at one time did not have one. I left my gun under the seat, as I sometimes do. It's under the seat now because I can't carry it in here. And my wife drove the car. She was stopped for speeding. She has a lead foot. Thankfully, the officer let that slide. But technically, it was a criminal offense that could expose her to 1 year in prison. I've seen the question asked several times, is this being enforced? I would direct your attention to a Supreme Court of Georgia case, which is Lindsay versus the state. The site is 277 Georgia 772. This case is from 2004, just 2 years ago. But we like to call this the duct tape rule because open and fully exposed to view means open to the view of all onlookers. In this case, the gun was in the door, the pocket of the driver's side door, where one officer could see it and the other could not. The Court of Appeals upheld his conviction, saying that an armed person does not comply with the mandate of the statute unless his or her weapon is displayed so as to be visible to all observers. Short of duct tape on the forehead, I'm not sure how one accomplishes that. So this change would allow those eligible for a license, which means no felons, no people under 21, to carry a weapon anywhere in the car the places where they can't now. That's important for a lot of people. I had a temporary period where, because of the probate court's refusal to follow the 60-day rule that you all have written into the statute, I was temporarily without a firearms license. I generally carry 2 guns. They won't both fit in the glove box. I don't have a center console in my car. That left me with a decision to either violate the law or leave this gun openly on top of my dashboard where anybody can see it when I'm stopped at a red light, which was a situation I was not comfortable with. So, given that, by the way, there's another case addressing under the seat with the butt protruding, Moody versus State, and they again upheld a gun that had the butt visible to the officer during a traffic stop as concealed and therefore in violation of OCGA 16-11-126. So, our membership strongly supports changing this bill. My experience in law enforcement has led me to believe that this sort of bill will not be a problem because it's only for the law-abiding. As has been stated previously, criminals are going to carry concealed without a firearms license and probably shouldn't be carrying a gun anyway, but they probably will be.
Questions of Mr. Stone?
Mr. Chairman, I have a quick question.
Representative Collins.
My quick question, I would like the cite on the Moody case.
The Moody case is from the Court of Appeals, 1987, and the site is 184 Georgia Appeals 768. It says the officer saw what he recognized as the handle of a gun protruding from under the driver's seat of the appellate's vehicle, and the court ruled here a gun slightly protruding from under the seat of a vehicle does not put others on notice and therefore is not, quote, fully exposed, close quotation marks, within the statute governing such weapons.
Further questions, Mr. Stone? Thank you very much, Mr. Stone.
Thank you for your time.
That was all the people that we had signed up to speak on this bill. Any questions, any further questions from members of the committee? Chairman Franklin, then Representative Benfield. Not recognized quite yet. Representative Benfield.
I'm just going to ask the same question I asked before. I'm always concerned he's not at the table. This is a bill that deals with law enforcement, yet we haven't heard from the Sheriff's Association or the Chief of Police Association, and I don't see them here in the audience. Does the author of the bill know if either one of those organizations or any other law enforcement agency has
they have an official position on this bill one way or the other.
Well, this bill went through subcommittee.
That's correct, and no one showed.
Was there people speaking pro or con?
Just the lady that spoke.
Ms. Johnson.
Correct.
That's her name. Other than that?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. Now, you want to respond to Representative Benfield?
We spoke briefly, but there was no official concerns to me that they brought forth to have me bring out. But we did speak. The Sheriff's Association, we had a discussion about a couple issues, and I think they were addressed. Yes, sir. Everyone I talked to, I have not heard any complaints from any of the police officers I know or talked to.
Vice Chairman Mumford.
I've had long experience with this statute, both as a district attorney and as an attorney, and the signal feature of this statute has always been that it has been unintelligible. I favor the fact that this proposed bill will tend to clarify what before was completely unclear and confusing to everyone. I am concerned about how our law enforcement will be affected by this change in the law. I'm disappointed that none of the law enforcement agencies have spoken about their opinion or how they view this. However, it is their failure to speak is one of the reasons that I intend to vote in favor of this bill today. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. Further questions of the author? Further questions? What's the pleasure of the committee? Chairman Franklin.
I move House Bill 89 do pass.
We have a motion that House Bill 89 be given a do pass recommendation by the committee. Is there discussion now on that motion? Is there discussion? Hearing no discussion, the Chair will call the question. All in favor of the motion to give House Bill 89 a do pass recommendation, please indicate by raising your right hand. All opposed? The motion has carried by a vote of 12 to 5, and that bill will be reported to the Rules Committee with a favorable recommendation. We've made the bill assignments, or subcommittee assignments. That completes our work for today. The meeting will be adjourned. We'll meet again Wednesday at 3 p.m.